Today, let's start with the lesson Albert Einstein at School, written by Patrick Pringle. Albert Einstein at School is a story that is taken from another story called as the Young Einstein. Okay, so Patrick Pringle wrote that book, the Young Einstein, and from that a section has been taken for your lesson. Look at the introduction given in the text. Albert Einstein, 1879 to 1955, is regarded as the greatest physicist since Newton. So he has been found to be the greatest physicist after Newton. Genius as a physicist. In the following extract, right, in the following lesson, a part taken from a book, and which book is that? From the Young Einstein, the well-known biographer Patrick Pringle describes the circumstances which led to Albert Einstein's expulsion from a German school. So you can look at the actual person, Patrick Pringle, the famous biographer from whose book, The Young Einstein, which was published in 1965, this extract, Albert Einstein at School, has been taken. Now if you look at Patrick Pringle's works, he has written many other books like 101 Great Lives, Hue and Cry, The Young Dickens, etc. If you look at who Albert Einstein was, this is who he was. He was born in Ulm. So we know that he is a great physicist. He was a genius as a physicist. He was born in Germany, in the kingdom of Württemberg in the German Empire on 14th March 1879. You can see who his father was. This is his father, Hermann Einstein. He was a salesman and an engineer. His mother, you can see in the other corner, is Pauline Einstein. Albert attended a Catholic elementary school from the age of 5. So he attended elementary school run by Catholic priests from the age of 5. So that's when he started his education. For 3 years he was there in that school, in that Catholic elementary school. He's got that Catholic elementary school introduction. At the age of 8, he was transferred to Louis Paul Gymnasium. Nowadays it is known as Albert Einstein's Gymnasium because he studied there, where he received advanced primary, that is higher primary, and secondary school education up to probably 10th standard, until he left Germany 7 years later. 7 years later, after 7 years of this schooling he had, and then he left Germany. In 1894, his family moved to Italy, first to Milan and then a few months later to Pavia. When the family moved to Pavia, Einstein stayed in Munich to finish his studies in the same gymnasium, Louis Paul Gymnasium, at the Louis Paul Gymnasium, right. Okay, so what is this story about, this extract about? It's a brief introduction to something that troubled Einstein when he was an adolescent. Albert Einstein at School, which is the lesson, describes Einstein's struggles at Louis Paul Gymnasium, those 7 years, his school in Munich. So in which you can see that he had clashes with some of his teachers, and he had problems which is also part of the struggles that he endured during his adolescence. So, he had a very troubled adolescence, stayed as a paying guest with a noisy landlady, and how that was a source of great stress to him. And then there is also an introduction to how there is no escape in going to school, nor peace when coming back home, no peace at school nor in his lodging. Finally, all these things led to his being expelled from school. This is what the lesson is all about. Okay, so you can say he was a victim of circumstances, or so many other things you can say. Okay, before you actually go into the lesson, there's something that I want you to look at. I call it the curse of the adolescent. Adolescence in every human being is a time for developing independence. So, if you have been just listening blindly to what your father had been saying, or your teacher had been saying, or your mother has been saying, this is the time when you want to think differently from them. You want to think that you are not like your father, that you have different opinions from your father, you are not like your mother or not like your teachers, that you are different from all of them, and you have an independent existence. You are searching for your identity. This is who I am, you want to say. Typically, adolescents exercise their independence by questioning. Usually, how do they try to show that they are different from others? They question established ideas, establish ideologies, and established behavior. They question it, or they go into challenging. They go one step further, they challenge that these things are not right. What does it end up in? They break up rules. They break a lot of rules. So that means they are more or less like antisocial elements. Typically, they are like antisocial elements. They are against society. Now, there is a certain role that we as today's parents and doctors realize. Parents and doctors must distinguish occasional errors of judgment. Sometimes adolescents believe certain things are true, and we know very well that they are not true. Okay, so these we call as occasional errors of judgment, mistake in making a judgment, right? And parents and doctors must know that these are, some occasional errors like this can be ignored, but not things that are going to be long lasting. For example, they must know that when a child is setting into a pattern of misbehavior, is beginning to have a pattern of misbehavior that is beginning to set in his character as a permanent kind of behavior, and therefore they must do everything in their power to make sure that there is some intervention and that this permanent pattern of misbehavior will get changed. For example, some adolescent boys may become rowdies. In their desire to make their own identity, instead of just making their own identity, they begin to identify with antisocial elements, people who take to violence in order to solve their problems. So when things go to that extent, it is beginning to have a big effect, not just on themselves, but on the society around them. They start becoming social misfits. So that means one day society is going to reject them totally. So that's when professional intervention is required. Parents and doctors must realize this, that beyond a certain limit, this breaking of rules, this questioning, this challenging is going to end up in trouble. How do they realize that? The severity and frequency of infractions are guides. That is, when it starts getting severe, when this breaking of rules, when this challenging, when these questions start becoming very severe and very frequent, when these infractions refers to conflicts. When they become frequent and severe, it becomes a guide to parents and doctors that they need to step in and make a change. Now this affected Einstein also. How the curse affected Albert Einstein's schooling. It happens to a lot of students. It's not just Albert Einstein who suffered from it. In Albert Einstein, we see clearly that he is trying to exercise his independence by questioning or challenging the way he should learn and breaking the rules of the school, which ask him to study all the subjects, not just few subjects. He breaks the rules, studies only some of the subjects, not all. In the 1960s and the 70s, when Albert Einstein went to school, his parents and doctors, who must distinguish occasional errors of judgment, maybe it is a little earlier, I don't know whether it is the 60s or the 70s, it could be a little earlier, right, when he went to school. The book was published in 1965, so I'm assuming too much, I think, when I say 60s, 70s, maybe it's in the 50s, maybe it's in the 40s, or whenever it is when he went to school. It was quite early, and people didn't know too much about how to handle adolescence, right? His parents and doctors, who must have learned to distinguish occasional errors of judgment from patterns of misbehavior that require professional intervention, had not been well informed, so they did not know what to do. And in those days, what would naturally set itself right, for example, problems of adolescent behavior set itself right when the child becomes adult, in most cases, right? So when you think that this will become all right in due course of time, you just tend to ignore it. Parents ignored it, doctors also ignored it, right? They could not understand why he did not want to learn for exams, but they knew that one day he will become all right. So they just left him. They just tried to deal with it by closing their eyes. Adolescence cannot be forced. You know, in the school where Albert Einstein studied, they tried to force these adolescents. Most of them were able to submit themselves to that force, not people like Albert Einstein. Many adolescents cannot be forced to follow the dictates of elders and peers. Trying to do so, if they try to do in spite of the resistance of the adolescents, would lead to a lot of stress, leading to depression and open rebellion. The only way forward when this happens is to let the child have his way. Allow him to do what he wants to do, because there's nothing else you can do. This is then what happened to Albert Einstein. So it shows very clearly, although he was a genius as a physicist, as an adolescent, he was a typical adolescent. He had his way and left for his hometown to continue his studies on his own terms. This helped him to rise to great heights. Of course, there was a lot of struggle, but finally, as luck would have, as he, let's say his luck would have it, or chance would have it, he somehow came up. A lot of people who didn't come up, the percentage of people who didn't come up, having let go, having been allowed to do exactly as they please, is much more than people like Einstein, who still happened to survive and do well. Okay, so who are the characters here in this lesson? The characters in this lesson are the young Albert Einstein, Mr. Braun, the history teacher, Yuri, friend of Albert, Elsa, Einstein's cousin sister and very close friend, Dr. Ernst Weil, the doctor, Mr. Koch, the mathematics teacher, and the headmaster.